Imagine waking up one morning to find that everyone you know is furious with you. Not just angry, but deeply shaken, like you've done something unspeakable. They all swear you were at a party last night, saying and doing things that made their skin crawl. The problem? You know, with absolute certainty, that you never left your house. But what if they're right? What if you were there, and something far worse than a memory gap is hiding in the shadows of your mind? And what if, deep down, you're terrified to remember? The scent of damp paper filled Ellie's study as she sat hunched over her desk, staring at the asylum blueprints that had mysteriously appeared in her possession. The edges of the old document were frayed, smudged with dirt, as if it had been clawed from some hidden place. Her hands trembled as she traced the crude sigil etched on the back. It looked like a haphazard swirl at first glance, but the longer she stared, the more it seemed to shift, pulsing faintly in the lamplight. Ellie exhaled shakily and pressed her hands to her temples. A hollow throb had taken root behind her eyes, the same relentless ache she'd felt since waking up that morning to accusations she couldn't answer. The voices of her friends played on an endless loop in her mind. You were there, Ellie. You led us to the asylum. What the hell is wrong with you? But she hadn't been there. Had she? Her fingers brushed the corner of her phone, and she hesitated before unlocking it. Her group chat buzzed like a hive of angry bees, notifications piling up as the others tried to piece together what had happened. Ellie scrolled through the messages, her pulse quickening. I swear she was different last night. Like, detached. You were acting weird, Ellie. You kept saying it was all a game. Does anyone know where Riley is? He left with Ellie, then disappeared. Her stomach lurched. Riley had been her friend since college, the one person who never made her feel like an outsider in her own skin. Now he was missing, and she was at the center of a mystery she couldn't unravel. She wanted to scream at them, beg them to believe her. But what could she say? That she didn't remember? That she was innocent? Liar, she whispered to herself, her voice cracking. The word hung in the still air, as heavy as the shadows pooling in the corners of the room. A sudden creak broke the silence. Ellie's heart jumped as she spun toward the attic door. It was ajar, though she was certain she'd shut it earlier. Slowly, she rose, her bare feet brushing against the cold wooden floor. The house seemed to hold its breath as she climbed the narrow staircase, her fingers trailing along the splintered railing. The attic was dimly lit by moonlight filtering through a single dust-coated window. She stood frozen in the doorway, her eyes drawn to a figure in the mirror at the far end of the room. Her reflection, but wrong. The face stared back at her with a faint, almost imperceptible smirk, its expression foreign, cruel. "Who are you?" she whispered. The reflection didn't answer, but Ellie swore she saw its lips twitch. The faint hum she'd been hearing for days grew louder, pressing against her eardrums. She stepped back, her throat tightening as the floor creaked beneath her. And then the mirror cracked, just a hairline fracture, but enough to make her chest seize with dread. Behind her, the sound of footsteps. Ellie's breath came in shallow bursts as she froze at the top of the attic stairs. Her eyes darted to the cracked mirror at the far end of the room, the fracture branching like a jagged spider web across the surface. The smirk on her reflection lingered in her mind like a stain she couldn't scrub away. It was absurd, impossible, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it had moved on its own, just enough to unsettle her to the core. Behind her, the sound of footsteps again, soft and deliberate. She spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs, but the staircase was empty. The house had fallen silent, the oppressive kind of quiet that makes even the smallest noise feel deafening. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely rising above a whisper. Her words disappeared into the gloom. She took a cautious step back into the attic, her eyes scanning the dim space for any sign of movement. Shadows clung to the rafters, shifting subtly as if alive. The air felt thicker here, tinged with the faint scent of mildew and something else, something acrid and metallic. It reminded her of the old basement at her grandparents' house, the one she'd always avoided as a child. A splinter jabbed into her bare foot, breaking her trance. She winced, bending down to pull the offending shard free. As she straightened, her eyes caught something she hadn't noticed before. A faint trail of dirt smeared across the attic floorboards, leading to the mirror. Ellie's stomach churned. The dirt looked fresh, damp and dark, as if someone had tracked it in only moments ago. Her mind raced. Did I do that? The memory of waking up to asylum blueprints, dirt under her nails, and that damned sigil flashed through her thoughts. She tried to convince herself it was just an old attic, dirty and neglected, but she couldn't ignore the sharp pang of unease gnawing at her. She forced herself closer to the mirror, each step heavier than the last. The trail of dirt stopped just in front of it, and for a moment, Ellie felt an overwhelming sense of déjà vu. She'd been here before, hadn't she? Her reflection loomed larger as she neared, its fractured surface distorting her face into grotesque shapes. "Who are you?" she whispered again, almost pleading this time. Her reflection tilted its head, mirroring her movement. But there was something wrong with the eyes. Her eyes. They seemed darker, deeper, as though the glass was hiding something behind them. A faint hum vibrated through the room, growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't coming from the mirror. It was coming from inside her head. Ellie clutched her temples, her knees buckling. The sound wasn't just a hum anymore. It was a voice, faint and muffled, like someone speaking from underwater. "You let me in," it murmured, the words barely audible but unmistakable. She staggered back, her heel catching on the uneven floorboards. Panic clawed at her chest as the hum grew louder, splitting into a cacophony of overlapping whispers. The whispers didn't feel distant anymore. They felt intimate, invasive, as if the walls themselves were breathing them into her ears. Her gaze snapped back to the mirror. The fractured glass shimmered faintly in the dim light, and for a fleeting moment, Ellie swore she saw movement behind her reflection, something dark and shapeless shifting just out of sight. A loud crash shattered her focus. It came from downstairs, breaking through the oppressive whispers like a thunderclap. Ellie spun toward the attic stairs, her body rigid with fear. She didn't want to go down there, not when she felt so exposed, so vulnerable. But someone, was in her house. The whispers fell silent, replaced by the sound of her own racing pulse. Slowly, she descended the stairs, her footfalls muffled by the oppressive fog seeping into her mind. When she reached the bottom, the hallway stretched before her, darker than it should have been. "Riley?" she called out, desperate for a familiar voice, but only the silence answered her. And then, from the direction of the kitchen, came a low, guttural laugh. Ellie sat at the edge of her bed, her fingers clutching the faded photograph that had arrived earlier that day. It was impossible to ignore the creeping unease that wrapped itself around her as she studied the image. There she was, standing in the center of the infamous mirror room at Willowbridge Asylum, smiling. But the memory didn't exist. No matter how hard she tried, her mind refused to piece together the jagged fragments of that missing night. Her gaze lingered on the reflection in the mirror, captured in the photograph. It wasn't her smile. Too wide, too stiff, like something trying too hard to mimic human emotion. And her eyes, they looked hollow, as if something else had taken root inside her, staring back through her skin. "Why can't I remember?" she whispered to the empty room. Her voice cracked under the weight of her own confusion, her own fear. The words of her friends replayed in her mind, their voices a mixture of anger and concern. "You were there, Ellie." The certainty in their tone only deepened her dread. She pressed her thumb over her own face in the photograph, as though blotting it out might erase the strange reality she'd been thrust into. But the questions persisted, scratching at the edges of her sanity. She'd stayed home that night. She knew she had. She could picture herself here, curled up on the couch with her tea and a documentary humming faintly in the background. Yet there were gaps now, moments where the memory blurred, became indistinct. Was that tea hot or cold? Had she fallen asleep? Ellie squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the rising tide of doubt. She hated this. The feeling of slipping, of losing control. Her mother's illness had started this way, with lapses in memory and sudden behavior she couldn't explain. Ellie had vowed never to let herself become like that, to never let her mind turn against her. The house groaned softly in the quiet, a low, tired sound that set her nerves on edge. She forced herself to stand, clutching the photograph in her hand. The attic door loomed at the end of the hall, slightly ajar, though she was certain she'd shut it before. She approached slowly, her bare feet brushing against the floorboards that seemed to sigh beneath her weight. As she pushed the door open, the darkness of the attic swallowed her. The faint scent of mildew and damp wood greeted her, sending a chill down her spine. The photograph slipped from her fingers, fluttering to the ground as her gaze locked on the mirror at the far end of the room. The crack she'd seen earlier had grown, splintering into sharp veins that glimmered faintly in the moonlight. But it wasn't the crack that froze her in place. It was the faint imprint of a hand on the glass, pressed against the inside, as though trying to push through. The silence broke, with the sound of footsteps echoing below. Not slow or cautious, but hurried, insistent, heading straight for her room. Ellie gripped the doorframe, her breath shallow as the footsteps from below grew louder, each one a thunderclap in the silence of the house. Whoever, or whatever, was in her home wasn't trying to be discreet. The sound was deliberate, almost aggressive, as if taunting her. She took a step back into the attic, her knees weak and trembling, her pulse hammering in her ears. The photograph lay at her feet, its image upturned. She didn't dare look down at it again, couldn't face that hollow-eyed version of herself captured in the asylum's mirror room. Her stomach churned as questions she couldn't answer swirled like a storm in her mind. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. Ellie pressed her back against the wall, her fingers gripping the rough wood behind her. Every instinct screamed for her to run, to bolt for the window or find something, anything to defend herself with. But she couldn't move. The air in the attic felt heavy, suffocating, as though the shadows themselves were pressing against her skin. "Riley," she whispered, the sound barely audible over her own heartbeat. She hated how desperate she sounded, how frail. The attic door creaked wider, the faint light from the hallway spilling into the gloom. A shadow stretched across the floorboards, too tall and too thin to belong to anyone she knew. Ellie bit back a gasp as the shape paused, motionless in the doorway, its presence more oppressive than any figure should be. For a moment, the shadow seemed to waver, as if the air around it rippled like heat rising off asphalt. Then, slowly, it stepped inside. There was no one there. The floorboards groaned under invisible weight, the shadow detaching itself from the hallway light to move deeper into the room. Ellie pressed her hands to her mouth to stifle the scream clawing at her throat. The smell of dirt and something sickly sweet, rot, maybe, flooded her senses. She squeezed her eyes shut, as if darkness could protect her from whatever was now standing only feet away. "Ellie!" The voice was barely a whisper, but it sliced through the air like a blade. It didn't sound like Riley, or any voice she recognized. It was soft, melodic, but tinged with malice. Her eyes snapped open, and she froze. The mirror across the room was no longer empty. Her reflection was there, but it wasn't mirroring her anymore. It tilted its head, the cruel smirk she'd seen in the photograph etched across its face. "Who are you?" she croaked, her voice barely audible. Her reflection leaned closer, its lips moving, though the sound wasn't coming from the mirror. It was behind her now. "You know who I am," it murmured. Ellie spun around, her body moving before her brain could catch up. The attic was empty. The shadow, the voice, everything was gone. But when she turned back to the mirror, the crack had grown wider, and the smirk was still there. Behind her, from the darkness of the hallway, came a sound. A soft, deliberate knock. Ellie's hands trembled as she stepped over the threshold into the asylum's infamous mirror room. The air inside was thick, oppressive, as though the walls themselves bore witness to unspeakable horrors. The faint hum that had haunted her for days now resonated all around her, a low, vibrating pulse that seemed to seep into her bones. The room was colder than the rest of the asylum, the chill sinking deep into her skin. Dust motes floated lazily in the dim light of a single flickering bulb, and in the center of the room stood the mirror. It was larger than she'd imagined, its tarnished frame twisted into grotesque shapes, faces, bodies, limbs merging in unnatural contortions. The crack running through the glass was sharper now, deeper, almost as if it were alive. Ellie's chest tightened as she approached, the weight of her own reflection pulling her closer. She could feel the room shifting around her, the air pressing against her like an invisible hand. Her reflection stared back, not mimicking her movements, but watching her, its expression eerily calm. "You've been here before." The voice came softly, from nowhere and everywhere at once. Ellie froze. The words weren't hers, but her reflection's lips had moved. It smiled, slow and deliberate, that same cruel smirk that had haunted her since she first saw the photograph. "Stop," she whispered, her voice cracking. She wanted to look away, but her eyes wouldn't obey. Her reflection tilted its head, amusement glinting in its hollow gaze. "You know the truth, Ellie. You just don't want to remember." "Who are you?" Ellie choked out, taking a stumbling step back. The hum grew louder, resonating in her skull. The reflection's smile widened, splitting unnaturally across its face. The edges of the mirror began to ripple like water, distorting the room around it. "I'm what you buried," it said, its voice cutting through her thoughts. "Your fear, your guilt, everything you locked away. The night everyone remembers. That was me. You let me out." Ellie's knees buckled, and she gripped the edge of a nearby table to steady herself. The flashes of memory she'd been trying to suppress crashed over her like a wave, her hand tracing the sigil in the asylum's dirt floor, the flicker of candlelight, the oppressive presence that had slithered into her chest, cold and all-consuming. "No," she whispered, shaking her head violently. "No, I didn't. I didn't." "Oh, but you did," the reflection purred. "And now I'm free." The glass shuddered, the crack splitting wider. Ellie's breath hitched as she saw something stirring within the reflection. A shadow, dark and formless, writhing like a living thing. Desperate, she grabbed the first thing her hand found, a heavy shard of metal, and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered, the sound deafening as shards exploded outward. The hum stopped instantly, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. For a moment, Ellie stood motionless, her chest heaving. She stared at the fractured remnants of the mirror, the shadow within now gone. Relief began to wash over her, until she glanced down and saw her own reflection in the shards. It was smiling. Behind her, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, growing closer. Ellie staggered back, her breath catching as footsteps stopped just outside the room. The silence stretched, heavy and unnatural, until a voice broke through, soft and laced with malice. "Ellie, you can't run from yourself forever." Her knees trembled as she glanced at the shattered mirror. Every shard reflected her image, but it wasn't her. In each fragment, distorted versions of herself walked the asylum's halls, her hands tracing symbols on the walls, her lips whispering in an unfamiliar language. One shard showed her standing at the asylum's door, ushering Riley inside. "No," Ellie muttered, shaking her head violently. But the next fragment twisted her stomach. It showed her shoving Riley into the mirror, his terrified face disappearing as the glass rippled like water. The shards began to vibrate, rising into the air as a low hum swelled around her, growing louder and louder until it filled her skull. Ellie clamped her hands over her ears, screaming, but it was no use. The lights blinked out, plunging her into darkness. For a moment, there was only the sound of whispers, dozens of voices speaking her name. Then, silence. When she opened her eyes, she was home. Relief turned to dread as her phone buzzed with a message. "You'll never be alone again." She turned to the hallway mirror. Her reflection stared back, its smile impossibly wide.